Much ink has been spilled on the seminal literary work Homestuck in the past 15 years that the world has been graced with its presence, and the academic discourse surrounding the piece will likely continue until it is buried from consciousness entirely or the human species goes completely extinct. As a natural consequence of this, seeing as it's both one of the principal ideas of the webcomic simultaneous to the fact that the principal point of many people's existences, queer expressions of gender and how Homestuck discusses those queer expressions are an extremely important factor in the discussion surrounding the comic. Much of the comic is explicitly dedicated to homoerotic relationships, but transness and gender discourse is much more subtle, only directly coming up toward the end of the text. That being said, transgender identity manifests and is subtextually discussed through several characters within the work, and gender itself has much written on it as well, it becoming a core fixture of the narrative toward the comic's end. June Egbert is the principal character of Homestuck as a work, and much of the comic centers around her coming into her own and eventually overcoming the structures of text and metatext themselves. However, her transition is apocryphal, shrouded in vagary and obscura. Though it is often the most discussed aspect of Homestuck's transness, it is also the most difficult to read into the work and extract meaning from outside of its firm establishment of Homestuck as a fluid and collaborative work. June's transition was not preordained by an authorial source. It was a moment of happenstance from a fan who won a contest. While much of the fan speculation of our postmodern artistic reality results in pointless theorizing about the authorial intent of a work, fan speculation as queer readings have much more meaning to them than the average fan theory through how they empower queer fans to interpret and discuss the text, and Homestuck's shape is already so defined by its fandom that it simply makes sense. Homestuck was initially told in a call and response format, where players of the work would send in community suggestions for the text to take for its next movements artistically. It also had much of the characters' names determined by fans, and the author openly admitted several times to writing parts of the work in response to viewing fan speculation online. Naturally, June's transition is the ultimate triumph of this ideological form, a work overtaken in the name of trans femininity, the marginalized steering the craft over any preconceived notions of authorship. That is the spirit of Homestuck in many regards, a literary work that exists as a product of no individual yet a collective of ideologues, the ultimate in collectivist postmodernism as literature. June's transition is not only the hypothetical trans woman conquering the narrative, but her reaching her apex narratively as well. Toward the end of Homestuck, June gains complete control over the work through a power known as the retcon. Here, she has extended power beyond even textual depictions. Homestuck is the living text edited even by its own characters. This extends to how in reality, trans women exist on the outskirts of society, breaking down understood social structures through our very existence as an affront to them. June deconstructs the text of Homestuck through internal and external means, forever on the cusp of society and forever challenging its preconceptions for a better future. Homestuck's gender discussion hardly ends with June as interesting and defining to the work as her expression of it is. Many members of the cast discuss the questions surrounding the topic as well. Characters such as Dave and Dirk Strider, though not possessing widespread subtextual transgender readings or any explicit transgender discussion, discuss gender as well through the deconstruction of patriarchal expectations for men. Far be it from me to center the interests of men on this channel, but it's still an interesting bit of the comic to have the two come to terms with how the expectations have formed their lives. Growing up, Dave wanted nothing more than to be like his older brother, and that led to him forming a personality entrenched entirely in ironic facades, a false machismo self to mask the real one. Over the course of Homestuck, that facade is broken slowly, and Dave is allowed to engage in gay love with one of the other main characters of the comic by the narrative, but the specter of his older brother haunts him throughout, even coming to him as a figure his age due to some complex video game schema as Dirk. Throughout the Homestuck epilogues, while Dave has moved past this masculine ironic facade in some ways, not so much in others, Dirk is still trapped within it, allowing it to inform many of his actions even if he doesn't realize it. His desire for control over the narrative, notably manifesting in several women within the text being his primary subjects of control, and his need to be viewed as the intelligent puppet master. Within the work, this is because Dirk and his definitions of masculinity are entirely intertwined with the symbol of ultimate evil and patriarchy within Homestuck as a text, the two inextricably tied. Lord English, also known as Caliborn, prior to his transformation into the god of double death. The composition of Lord English and how it reflects on its constituents is an incredibly interesting yet also incredibly difficult to explain part of Homestuck as a work. A robotic clone of Dirk that he constructed, another expression of his machismo ironic ego, is one of the many factors that, alongside Caliborn, composes Lord English. Thus, Dirk's masculinity and ego were ingredients in the orchestration for the end of all universes, and this is textually explored extremely explicitly with his ability to create fractures of his ego with his powers as the Prince of Heart. Even in the Candy epilogue, a narrative timeline where Dirk is dead, he still yet lives on as a specter haunting the mind of his ex-boyfriend, forever a stain on the narrative that vies for some modicum of control, and an ironic contrast to the love that, though tumultuous, Dave shares with his own gay paramour in the Meat timeline. This association with the toxically masculine and utter control and domination is also reflected through another constituent of Lord English, the troll Equius. Equius is a character within Homestuck that, while he is alive, doesn't do much of anything before he is killed, largely existing as a symbolic representation of the fascistic nature of troll society. That he, arguably the most uncomfortable and internally sinister of the trolls, is the most deeply associated with symbols like musculature and stallions and, in the most obvious case, literal phalluses, strikes an obvious connection with the toxic masculinity Homestuck is attempting to deconstruct, that being that it's one of the most evil forces in the world. Even Eredin, who is a character also obsessed with the reactionary construction of troll society, has an implied trans-feminine side to him in PesterQuest that, if walked, might have saved him from his radicalization. Equius has no actual limiters. When Equius is alive, he is also obsessed with control. He both desires to control those of a lower racialized class status than him through his attempt coercion of Aradia into falling in love with him and his control of who his best friend Nepeta interacts with, in addition to a fetishistic desire to be controlled by those of a higher racialized class status than him, the latter of which he attempts to hide as part of his masculine shroud. That obsession with control is what eventually makes him meet his demise, a troll of a higher racialized class status killing him through exploitation of his fetishization of these power structures, and he is later revived as an extension of Dirk when he is combined into one entity with Equius Sprite, a game construct fusion of the two characters who becomes a pillar of Lord English's construction. Lord English, patriarchy defined, was not always Lord English, and the dominant identity in the discombobulated mixture that birthed him is Caliborn. Caliborn in and of himself is a facet in the comic's blunt commentary on the nature of the socially constructed and perceived gender binary. When he is introduced, he exists in the same body as his twin sister, Calliope, the two of them within one mind. The two resent this dichotomy, and Caliborn eventually murders Calliope in a bid to escape from her using a methodology that would take far too long to explain. Caliborn is the masculine and Calliope the feminine. Caliborn's archetypal role a monarchical lord, and Calliope's the artistic and inspiring muse. Caliborn the violent and Calliope the victimized. It's a fairly standard and frankly kinda lame depiction of patriarchal violence against those who it subjugates, but it's made more interesting by another wrinkle in the narrative that leaves it as more than a potential infantilization of the feminine. In another universe, Calliope prevailed over Caliborn, her expression defeating his, the strength of femininity and artistic creation integral to the patchwork of Homestuck's reality. She is the one who creates a black hole at the seat of Lord English's power in the comic's final stages, a black hole that in the epilogues is elucidated to be Lord English's final resting place. Though Calliope was overcome in the primary timeline, a Burkean ideal played straight, the feminine can't be kept down, and an echo of her from another reality eventually got her revenge for her fallen alternate self, and continues to make major plays in the epilogue against Dirk's narration. Of course, this rebellion was not done all by her lonesome. There are many characters who assist the alternate Calliope in her defeat of Lord English in the final movements of Homestuck's daunting text, and one of them is an odd character known as Dave Pettisprite Squared. Dave Pettisprite Squared is a game construct fusion made up of a Dave from an alternate timeline where he died, and the troll Nepeta, who perished a bit before the comic's halfway marker. That Dave from an alternate timeline himself was already a game construct, having become the nihilistic Dave sprite much earlier within the comic, fused with a dead crow. Red incarnate, a corpse given life in more ways than one. In that form, he spent much of his time in a similar positionality to Dave, echoing another man's attempts at a masculine facade, though unlike Dave, he was operating on two levels of separation. Attempting to be Dave, attempting to be Dave's brother, a performance of a performance, an illusion of an illusion. It is only through his accidental fusion with Nepeta and inevitable alignment into a being beyond gender expression that they are freed from these preconceptions. Dave Pettisprite Squared is Dave Pettisprite Squared, and no bounds or rules apply to their existence. It's fitting that, in the Meat epilogue, they are the one who ultimately flings Lord English into the black hole, sacrificing themselves in the process. It is only that which the patriarchy cannot understand understand that can defeat it, and only those who have shed their own masculinity and become reborn that can cure the poisons of it. All this discussion may make it seem that Homestuck as a text is one that I have little critique of with regards to its discourse surrounding the nature of gender, and to some degree that is true. I find that Homestuck gets too little credit for its ideas on gender often, and how it deconstructs and adapts them over the course of the work, and that many people have a tendency to interpret its ideas in bad faith, which kind of goes for Homestuck as a whole, to be frank. With that being said, there are choices made throughout the Homestuck legendarium of works that I find worth some negative discussion. Aspects like the trolls being a matriarchal society feel underdeveloped and largely played for comedy, especially when it's ruled by a character who's been criticized by many black critics as being, to avoid mincing words, a racial stereotype. She is further controlled by one manifestation of Lord English, Doc Scratch, who himself is a literal cue ball, as in white, pedophilic misogynist who fetishizes the aestheticism of Western gentry and literally becomes an English lord. Perhaps this is to some degree the work attempting criticism of how these contemporary imperial hierarchies all ultimately come back to white Western patriarchal thought. Regardless, however, much about her imperious condescension as a character is blatant misogynoir, especially through how she is actively sexualized by comparison to much of the rest of the adult cast of the comic, and it's one of Homestuck's worst qualities that people far more qualified than me on the subject matter have criticized extensively, and thus I defer to them here. The issues that I'm further qualified to discuss, however, crop up in the epilogues of the comic surrounding the characters of Roxy and Jade. Roxy is a character who, upon her introduction, was widely speculated to be a trans woman. It was a popular theory within Homestuck fan discussion, even if niche by virtue of it pertaining to the interests of a group that historically has had our interests cast aside for numerous reasons beyond the scope of this video. The most prominent aspect of the theory was the last two letters of her name, XY, which would be the chromosomal makeup of the average trans woman, and the text even highlights this as she's introduced. But even outside that, her interests and personality resonate a lot with many trans women's experiences. In the meat epilogue of the two Homestuck epilogues, Roxy is revealed explicitly to not be a trans woman and instead a trans-masked non-binary figure. To take a character so understood as being a trans woman by trans woman readers and to make them into a character that is positionally entirely exclusive to trans femininity is extremely hurtful, which is a quality of the epilogues that is generally admirable outside of this. However, there is so few meaningful depictions of trans femininity that trans women can latch onto, and to lose another one is a real moment of aimless spite from the work. This is fairly small compared to the worst sin of the epilogues, however, which is one of the most disturbing vectors of trans misogyny put to page in a text that didn't already wear it on its sleeve as a core feature of its identity. Without any way of getting around the subject matter, it's that Jade Harley has a dog's penis. In Homestuck, one of the many Kernel Sprite game construct fusions is that of a dead version of Jade with her pet dog Beckwhirl. It's a horrifying concept and one of the best moments in the comic, a woman both usurped from her position as herself and infused with her own pet into a position less than human. This Jade eventually becomes the main Jade through some narrative minutiae and attains a corporeal body, but keeps her dog ears and dog tail. This is never really addressed much throughout the comic proper, aside from her retaining the cute mannerisms of a dog and some dog-like instincts that get exploited by one of the text's main villains. With that being said, in the epilogues, it's revealed that Jade conceived a child with another one of the main characters, through an implement she received from the fusion with her dog. It's an uncomfortable and gross narrative beat that serves to turn Jade into a trans-misogynistic pornographic commodity, the myth of a woman with a penis who is not trans. This is an idea that is common within pornography of the trans feminine body. Sure, she has a penis, but she's a real girl who magically has one somehow, irregardless of material realities, not one of those trannies, the commenter might say as a means of internally rationalizing their own attraction to an exploitation of the bodies of trans women without seeing themselves as attracted to trans women, which is something cis-normative society is horrified by the prospect of in spite of being so obviously allured by us. The depraved trans misogyny of Jade's transformation into a fetish category is further amplified by the fact that it's not even a human's penis. It's a dog's. It's a revolting plot development in arguably Homestuck's deepest valley, somewhat mitigated by the fact it exists in its apocryphal works as opposed to the main body of the text, but ultimately still a massive stain on any discussion of gender that one might have with it. On a lighter note, no pun intended, there's one character that this text has neglected to mention until its endpoint to save the best for last. Vriska Circuit, one of the principal characters of Homestuck. Vriska's transness is never made explicit in the comic, but similar to June, it is an aspect of the work made evident in its apocryphal material. However, Vriska is arguably one of the most trans-feminine characters ever conceived on a fundamental level, regardless of any disparate work confirms it to be the case or not. She's an abrasive lesbian with butch inclinations who gets called a faggot and a fairy by her quote-unquote friends, which aren't insults typically reserved for cisgender women. She even has borderline personality disorder. In all seriousness, her hero worship of her female ancestor Mindfang and grappling with her socially ingrained ideas of femininity read is incredibly trans, along with her literal transhumanist nature as her body is altered through cybernetics and transfigured into something else, as well as her discussions with June when the two of them have a fling during the events of Homestuck's halfway marker, Act 5, Act 2. Though this relationship never goes anywhere after this, with June developing intense animosity for Vriska in the pages that would follow, their conversations of Vriska encouraging June to express her femininity more, giving her clothes that fit her fashion sense, and ultimately trying to make her into a hero like her, ultimately read as a more experienced trans woman trying to help a younger one crack her egg open. And though it's a basic idea, it's one that's hardly ever portrayed. The love between two trans women, if only for a brief moment, trapped among all the disparate reactionary forces of the universe that try to tear them apart, and in that love they become more themselves. June and Vriska can no longer love each other in the narrative, but for a brief moment in time the two of them did, and it was that angsty trans lesbian love that helped June find herself, like so many relationships between trans women do. Is this overly sentimental? Perhaps, but this is one of the most important passages in literature to me, and it was incredibly formative to the core of who I am. Maybe sentimental is a little earned for our Vriska Beelzebub in this parlay. Vriska is a key part of who I am as a woman, a dyke, and a tranny. Homestuck has a complex relationship to gender that's much more multifaceted than some would give it credit for. It has some intensely reactionary ideas in it, such as the infamous dog penis, and yet the text also contains Vriska, who is one of the most resoundingly important expressions of trans feminine identity that's been seen that wasn't simply autobiography. It is much like much of Homestuck. Fraught, but brilliant, and definitely worth investigation in spite of all the ugly parts, and one of the most fascinating reservoirs for discussion in the literary canon. This has been Arcadian Everlasting, who mercifully excised any mention of Little Cal from this video, signing off. Thank you for watching.